Broadly speaking, say for Thomas Aquinas, divine simplicity is the attribute that we posit specifically in the face of any sort of creaturely diversity, where you have in the created world all sorts of perfections that are spread about rather than being densely packed into a core perfection. And when we talk about the absolute divine simplicity, we're looking at the scattered arrangement of perfections, and we're noting that that scattered array doesn't have an equivalent entailment for the divine, that he's scattered, and there are parts outside of parts and these sorts of things. So apart from the real distinction between the divine persons, which is very explicit in leaving to the side, we're not going to deal with Trinity. We're going to deal with something that's more fundamental to Trinity, which is the divine simplicity. So apart from the real distinction of divine persons, all distinction that you find in God for Thomas is going to be thanks to the finitude of creatures in some respect. So you have the divine unicity, the divine perfection is going to be plurified or made manifold for the creatures and in the creatures and by the creatures. So the diversity as a diversity is not in God. There's still going to be a rational distinction between the attributes. So the attributes aren't synonymous to each other. They're not going to be emptied of all sorts of positive conceptual content. There's still going to be a rational distinction that obtains. So as we talk about God, we don't say that his holiness means the same thing as his love and these sorts of things, even though existentially speaking, they are the same thing.
Right.
This rational distinction, which Voetius deals with, later Thomas than Thomas, developed into two sorts of rational distinction. This becomes quite important to understand. So on the one hand, you would have a rational distinction of the reasoning, and then on the other of the reasoned, which are very awkward in English, and they are somewhat awkward in Latin, but it's denoting a very different way of how that rational distinction results. And there's going to be one way that divine simplicity has to go, and the other way is going to be very bad. So Voetius sides, in my opinion, correctly on the reasoned side. That's reasoned with a passive verb, in the sense that there's something that, you might think of it like this, that forces the mind toward this. The mind in its recipient posture of this causes this rational distinction. It's not simply imposed by the mind, which would be the reasoning. So the rational distinction, which Voetius gets into, and this is really the nub of divine simplicity for him, goes something like this. A rational distinction is something that the mind makes up, totally made up, in order to generate true knowledge. It's specifically a rational distinction, because when the mind makes it up, which is happening all the time when we know something, in certain cases that making up doesn't have something that corresponds to it in the object that's being known in reality. So even though the knowledge that we have, which is true and truly derived, involves in the process of our coming to know the use and the making of rational distinctions, those rational distinctions don't track onto the object that's being
Right.